How's it going, everybody? Sound working okay? Thumbs up. Good. uh, Brooklyn, I got your email. I'm sorry, I just haven't had a chance to get back to you. I'll go through and take a look at that. Sorry for ignoring you.
No worries.
All right. We'll have folks jumping in here as we continue to go through. A couple quick announcements. So we'll be scheduled to have. So when is SI session was last time. Quiz 7 or quiz 6 will be this next upcoming Wednesday. So remember that. So you still got a lot of time, but make sure that you're going through. The big thing, everyone, is to remember that tomorrow is the deadline to withdraw from the class. So I hope no one withdraws from the class. I'm not encouraging you to withdraw from the class, but I'm a big advocate of people knowing sort of what the rules and regulations are and things along those lines. And so, again, hopefully some of the slides I put up is kind of giving you a sense for where we're at in terms of, or where you're sort of existing in terms of grade types of things. But if you have any questions, let me know because, yeah, tomorrow's the last day to withdraw. And then after that, it gets hard, if not impossible, to pull out of the class. So depending on where you're at, what your time commitment and resources and all that stuff are, will kind of depend on stuff. So other than that, was slow. Got the emotional expression lecture uploaded. It's available on there now. It's short. It's like 30 minutes or so. The expression stuff is pretty straightforward. But let me know if you have any questions on that. Otherwise, any questions, concerns, anything like that before we jump into stereotypes and prejudice? Feeling okay about it? Okay. So let me go through. Okay. Where did... I'm not seeing any of you. What happened here? Normally I get to see your bright shining faces in the opposite screen while I'm doing this. How about okay, there we go. All right. Everybody see my slides? Okay, cool. Okay. Awesome. All right, cool. Going to go through, talk about, so this stuff is getting into some social psychology, and we're going to talk today about in-group, out-group, stereotype, prejudice, things along those lines. Super interesting stuff. And again, this tends to be in the domain of social psychology. So, there we go. Okay. So if we're talking about an in-group, in-group starts to become an important thing to be thinking about in terms of social psychology and understanding some of these dynamics that we're going to be talking about. An in-group, broadly defined, is just some group of individuals who we share some sort of cognitive or common identity. And the thing about an in-group, the thing that makes an in-group really, really powerful is that in-groups can be based on virtually any characteristic we can think of. Okay, so can someone give me an example of what an in-group might look like? What might define an in-group?
Political party?
There we go. It's low-hanging fruit. Thank you, Jonathan, for grabbing it the day after election. Exactly. Political party, right? And if we think about in-groups, right, we know that characteristics that are sort of more kind of central to an individual's identity start to become much more influential, right? And so for some people, Republican, Democrat, political affiliation starts to be a way that I reflect on how I view the world and things like that. And so, as we see time and time again in the country, political affiliation is a very, very, very intense and strong in-group. Okay, nice. Give me some other examples of in-groups. Engineers. Okay, nice. Yeah. Engineering started out as an engineer, sort of being an engineering student. Like it's a kind of an in-group, right? Like we're engineers, we're kind of doing that stuff. Cool. So profession can go through, I would say the same thing. I'm a clinical psychologist, right? So in-group, like, oh, these are psychologists, these are other folks, right? So career stuff, what other stuff can we have in terms of in-group?
Like race or ethnicity?
Yeah, race, ethnicity, Brooklyn is a big one, right? Or it can be a good one, right? Or a big one. If sort of my race ethnic identity is central to who I see myself as a person, then very, very strongly, right? But it's possible that sort of my race identity is sort of not something that I think of a whole lot, and so that it's not kind of central, right? So absolutely, we see in groups, right, based on, so I went to graduate school in Buffalo, New York, so I'm like Buffalo football fan, right? So you got like sports stuff like that, right? You have gender identity. You've got sort of, we're Wyoming, right? In group, right? Oh, we all live in Wyoming, so that's part of an in group. So in group can be based on functionally anything that you want. It's just the intensity of that in group starts to depend on how much I affiliate with that individual characteristic. Okay, outgroups are people who are going to be different. Outgroups are folks who are going to be apart. Outgroups are folks that are going to be separate or different from me. Okay? And again, sort of the in-group, if you're not in the in-group, you're necessarily in the out-group. And depending on sort of what I've created my in-group on, that out-group may be very important to me, or it sort of might be different. Okay? So think about like any like high school movie, right? Like where you got this group and that group and that group and that group, right? This may or may not have tracked to your own high school experience, but this is a sort of a good example of like, oh, we've got the jocks and the theater kids, and we've got sort of this over there and this over there, right? The stoners and the skaters and like that type of thing, all formulates this whole in-group, out-group piece of things, okay? And our in-group bias refers to our preference for individuals associated with my in-group, right? I tend to like people who are like me, and I tend to not like people or sort of be more cautious or not prefer people who aren't like me. We see this strong in-group bias, tendency to want to affiliate around sort of people who are like us, people who think like us, things along those lines. And again, right now, coming off of yesterday's election, a big sort of good example of sort of the type of in-group biases that we see both in terms of situations that we seek out and sort of the news that we surround ourselves in and the narratives and things along these lines, okay? And so in-group, out-group dynamics, I mean, this is something that's hardwired into folks, right? Like we are as human beings sort of wired to tend towards this in-group bias, right? It promotes community. It helps us feel more secure about ourselves, but also leading to exclusion and tolerance. It can serve to just solidify my beliefs that I already have. A lot of confirmation bias that goes on. We tend to not like or be fearful of things that we don't understand or things that seem different. And so sort of the dynamic that goes into this in-group bias. But the thing that's really interesting is how easy it is to create this type of in-group, out-group situation. And so the classic experiment in this sort of in-group, out-group bias referred to or known as the Robbers Cave experiment. So what they did basically with Robbers Cave is they had 22 fifth grade boys, okay, that they pulled into, and sort of as part of this experiment, and they recruited them to go to this summer camp. And what they did is they randomly selected, and sort of, again, just, it was completely random who got put in one camp, but they created 2 camps. One camp on either side of this lake in Roberts Cave State Park. One camp, one group of boys identified as the Rattlers, other group identified as the Eagles. Okay, Rattlers and Eagles, no one in either one of these groups had ever met each other before, right? So the only thing that happened here was that you came in, you're going to participate in camp, and you got randomly selected to be in the Rattlers and the Eagles. Now, the Rattlers and the Eagles didn't know each other existed, right? One camp was on one side of the lake, other camp was on the other side of the lake. They just spent a week in these camps just sort of being Rattlers or Eagles, okay? But after a week, what they did is they brought these boys together for a tournament, for medals, trophies, prizes, things like that, right? So a week, they're kind of hanging out as Rattlers and Eagles. And then after that week, bring them together and say, hey, Rattlers meet the Eagles, Eagles meet the Rattlers. What we're going to do is we're going to put you 2 groups together for some stuff. And what they found was started to develop in the context of this competition, strong in-group pride for this competition. Rattlers hated Eagles, Eagles hated Rattlers, verbal aggression, vandalism, physical confrontations across the Rattlers and the Eagles, right? And sort of part of this was sort of the creation of the in-group bias was just letting these boys hang out in their own camps and then bring them together. And even though like these 2 groups were no different from one another, the Rattlers, the Eagles, on any type of characteristic, they're functionally the same. But just being in this camp for a week said, here's Rattlers, here's Eagles, and now all of a sudden you bring them together in a competitive situation, fights, vandalism, Rattlers hate Eagles, Eagles hate Rattlers, all because of this in-group bias that we've created. Okay? People kind of see what they did here. Okay? And think about, like, to your own high school. Okay? So think about, so someone tell me where you're from and who your rival high school was.
I was from Big Piney.
Okay.
Wyoming.
Okay. So you're from Piney. Who you guys not like Pinedale? Pinedale's a little bit bigger school than you guys in Big Piney, right? Like who's your rival at Big Piney?
Pinedale, easily.
Easy. Okay. So like this is the thing, right? Piney hates Pinedale. Pinedale hates Piney, right? Tell me, Kate, tell me a little bit about Pinedale. What do those Pinedale fools look like? Tell me characteristics of those Pinedale kids.
It's kind of hard to say off of characteristics. And it's kind of really hard to talk about it.
I bet Pinedale's jerks, right? Pinedale thinks they're better than everybody, right? Like.
I would say there are a few individuals
right? Okay. Yeah. So this is the thing we see. Same thing. Like, so I grew up again. I like that. I like the Big Piney came out as the example. I graduated from Wind River High School, Fremont County, tiny school. Had like 25 people in my graduating class. Those bums in Shoshone, those were our rivals, right? In Shoshone, bunch of redneck inbreeders over in Shoshone, right? Shoshone's no different than Pavilion, right? It's the same group of people, right? But we've got this in-group sort of bias where we're identifying like all these characteristics of someone else, and objectively they're the same folks. There's no difference there going on, right? And so again, what we see, apologies from anybody from Shoshone out there? I always have to do this. I have to apologize from Shoshone. I don't mean it, but I'll do it on camera just because it's going up on YouTube. So just talking about sort of this in-group, the in bias. And so what going back to Roberts Cave, what they wanted to do then is try and resolve this in-group bias. Very, very easy to, okay, oh, nice. Like someone from Tongue River, Bighorn, those bums in Bighorn.
Those rich guys, they suck.
Right? So it's easy to see how this stuff is directly applicable in our own lives, right? But what in the Robbers Cave experiment, so experimenters got through and they're like, okay, wow, we've got these kids fighting, trying to we've created this in group. What we want to do now is try and resolve it, right? How do we go through and resolve this bias? And so what they've tried to do is go through and have them have these two groups, the Rattlers and the Eagles, just kind of hang around each other. And you think, oh, as soon as they're around each other long enough, that they'll resolve whatever these in-group biases are. Incorrect. It just sort of continued on. And if you think about in-group, out-group biases, particularly people who are in conflict, right? People have been living in conflict in close proximity for a long, long time, and it doesn't resolve on its own. What they found was that social contact alone was not helpful. But what they did is they manufactured a series of crises, right? So the water to the camp was disrupted, and so Rattlers and Eagles had to come together to get the water going for the camp. Or this other thing where we both need to work together towards a common goal. What they found was that being relatively successful in resolving some of the in-group, out-group biases, but very, very clear indication, and from this study and others, that just being around other people, particularly if in a situation where there continues to be at least the perception of competition for resources or status or something along those lines, not successful in going through and resolve this. So very, very easy to create, very, very difficult to resolve. Okay. Questions about in-group, out-group stuff? All right. So thinking about this, building on sort of in-group, out-group, and thinking about stereotypes. Okay. If I'm talking about a stereotype, what we're generally talking about, there's kind of trying to get some of this stuff teased apart. And if I'm a social psychologist, this is something that starts to become very important, some of the nuances here. But if I'm talking about a stereotype, I'm talking about generalizations about some group where I assign all the same characteristics to all members of that group. Okay, and what this is a heuristic, right? We talked about heuristics as being shortcuts. And so what we do with a stereotype is a form of heuristic where we go through and helps us organize some understanding or something about some other group. These are developed very early on and based on contact with just general knowledge of the outside world. Whatever my stereotype is about some other group of individuals, I don't necessarily have to have ever had direct contact with that group of individuals in order to sort of identify a stereotype, right? And stereotypes, lots of examples say men are more aggressive than women. It's a stereotype, right? Women tend to be more nurturing than men. Another example. Adolescents are moody, emotionally volatile, right? So these are stereotypes that are sort of heuristics that we go through and start to develop about a group of people. Now, some individuals in sort of that group or whoever we have the stereotype for may have those characteristics, but the problem with the stereotype is what we do is we broadly attach this to all members, and then we start to run into problems here. Okay, because once we've formed a stereotype, these stereotypes tend to be self-perpetuating for a number of different reasons. Okay, one is going to be confirmation bias. All right, Brooke, what color is your shirt? Blue. All right. My stereotype is people with blue shirts never pay attention during class. They're always screwing around on their phone doing something, right? And so I'm looking at Brooke's thing right now. I see that she's not looking in the camera. She's off doing other things, right? And so maybe what I do is that's evidence that Brooke's screwing around. When in fact, you're probably taking notes, right? Or doing something else like that, right? Or I ignore when you are here participating, sort of doing this type of stuff, right? And I'm selectively identifying and pulling out the times that's consistent with my belief and ignoring all the other stuff, right? So we see confirmation bias perpetuate stereotypes. We also see some biased interpretation of information that's not really clear on what's going on, right? So let's say I have my belief is that guys are jerks and guys are rude. Okay, and that's my belief about just men in general. Okay, and I go through and I'm, let's say, at a store and I see Jacob in there and Jacob's doing something and he moves past somebody or does something, right? It's really kind of ambiguous behavior. Like, it really means nothing from an objective standpoint, but what I do is I interpret that behavior as consistent with my stereotype, right? And so I see from across the store, maybe Jacob's at customer service involved in sort of an animated conversation. He's kind of waving his hands around, right? I'm like, look at that guy. There's a guy yelling at whoever is in the customer service thing. When in fact, that may be your friend that you're talking about. Just kind of, Jacob, are you an animated person? You talk with your hands?
Yeah, sometimes.
Okay, cool. Thanks for helping me out with this. So what we do is we see Jacob maybe talking with his friend doing this stuff. It's a completely different interaction than what I've sought. But I've gone through and I've interpreted that behavior as consistent with my stereotype, even though I have no knowledge that that's exactly what's going on. Okay. And then this is a particularly nefarious one, subtyping. Okay. What we do is we make exceptions, right? Everybody is like this. Like, people in this group are like this. Except if I get clear evidence that someone doesn't meet the criteria for that stereotype, what I do is I subtype that, right? I say, oh, well, you're the exception. You're the exception that proves the rule, right? You're the one who's, oh, you're actually not like that, but everybody else is, right? It allows me to acknowledge that you don't fit that stereotype without me having to change my stereotype, right? So, any women out there right now in STEM or math? Course, okay. Brooklyn. So what's your major?
Molecular biology.
Okay, so I say the ladies can't do STEM. Science is no place for ladies, right? But then you're in my class and you're a brilliant person and you're doing quite well. And I say, well, Brooklyn, you're doing okay. You're one of the good ones. Like you, yeah, I guess you, but all other women, no good in STEM, right? What I've done is I've just created a type for you because I can't deny the fact that you're killing it in my class, right? So what I do is I subtype you. I say, oh, you're one of the good ones. You're the exception. And then that way I have to, it's easier for me to do that than reformulate my entire stereotype about that women can't do math or sort of whatever that stereotype is, right? And then maybe sort of, Brooke, you raise your hand. What area are you in? Computer science. I'm like, oh, well, that's another one. And what we might start doing is we may end up with more people in our subtype category than there actually are people who we know in the other, but it just allows us to keep that cognitive frame. Okay. So through confirmation bias, sort of just my motivated interpretation, behavior, and subtyping, I can maintain this stereotype even if I'm consistently confronted with evidence that's inconsistent with that. Okay. And what we do is we see that these stereotypes lead to some self-fulfilling prophecies. All right. There was some really, really interesting research in the 60s on this self-fulfilling prophecy. An investigator named Rosenthal went into an elementary research to study these self-fulfilling prophecies. And what Rosenthal did was gave students this fake aptitude test. So went in and gave this a bunch of kids this fake exam. And after they went through and did it, told teachers, hey, what this test does is it's going to predict IQ. Here are your kids who are bloomers, and here are your kids who are just sort of your random everyday kids, right? In fact, whole thing was a sham. There was nothing going on in that test that predicted anything. But what they did is the investigators told the teachers of the kids in this class, hey, here are your kids who are bloomers. These are the ones we're predicting are going to have high IQ. Here's the ones who are just sort of your regular old plain Jane stuff. Okay? And what do you think happened at the end of the year when they went through and actually tested those kids? Who performed higher? The kids who, and so to be fair, to be clear, the kids weren't told anything, right? The actual children themselves weren't told, hey, you're a bloomer, you're not a bloomer, anything like that. Investigators just told the teachers. But at the end of the year, when they went through and took a look at standardized test scores for the kids who they had told teachers were bloomers and who the regular kids were, what do they think they found?
The bloomers did better.
Yeah, exactly, Maya. Why?
Because it's that whole self-fulfilling prophecy, so they're gonna,
Yeah, right? So probably what happened is those teachers said, hey, here are my bloomers, right? These are the kids who are going to go through and be sort of super high performing, right? And the other kids, like, well, these are just your regular old kids, right? Investigators didn't do anything else, right? But with this self-fulfilling prophecy, probably what are the mechanisms? What's going on? Anybody have any ideas for how those kids who were identified as bloomers ended up having higher scores?
The teachers have paid more attention to them.
Yeah, Jonathan, subtly, right? And if I'm a good teacher, right, I might not sort of be like, oh, hey, you're a dummy kid. I'm not going to teach you. I'm only going to teach the kids who are smart. But probably subtly what ends up happening is I start to behave in a way that's consistent with my expectation, right? And so probably those kids who are identified as bloomers got a little bit more attention, maybe got a little bit more challenging work, and at the end of the school year, when we look at standardized tests, the bloomers are in fact doing better than the other kids. And the idea is, or the explanation is it's through these self-fulfilling prophecies, right? And again, what makes this so insidious is that it's not necessarily intentional, right? Like, I'm just behaving in a way that's consistent with how I understand the world, but the way I behave and interact with people can increase or perpetuate sort of my beliefs, particularly if I'm sort of stuck in confirmation bias and subtyping and things along these lines, right? And so what we recognize within this area of research is that we start to behave in ways that are consistent with my beliefs, right? And this is where we start to get into some really, really tricky situations with things like racial stereotypes and things like that. If I have someone from a different group comes in and I'm interviewing for a job and there's research that looks at this, right? What I might find is that just my nonverbals and my sort of behavior and my interaction with them elicits a response that maybe I perceive as not being as good as some other some other individuals. So even if I say, oh, hey, I'm not prejudiced, I don't have anything that's going on, the way that I act that are subtly consistent with the ways some stereotypes that I may have can elicit behavior that then goes through and encourages those or reinforces those stereotypes for me. And so these are very, very difficult cycles to break people out of. So questions about stereotypes.
Based on Rosenthal's experiment, can self-fulfilling prophecies be indirect?
Say a little bit more about that, Jonathan. What do you mean?
Like before self-fulfilling prophecy, if you told the students, you're the bloomer, you're not the bloomer, and then, those test scores correlate with that. But with Rosenthal, he just told the teachers.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be like kind of indirectly.
Yeah. And that's what's going on here. But the same thing, we see this self-fulfilling prophecy with, and again, going back to some of you ladies who are in STEM, right? Seeing that this stereotype, and the other thing that's insidious about stereotypes is the people who are in a stereotype group often hold the same stereotypes sometimes, right? And so if I'm a woman in STEM, I might say, well, guys are better at math and science than me, right? Which then might start to subtly impact even sort of early on in like elementary, high school. Oh, girls aren't good at math, so I don't work on math enough or as much as somebody else, or I don't sort of go through and try. And so we get that self-fulfilling prophecy in our own situation as well. We also see things like stereotype threat, right? Some research looking at if you bring, let's say, stop picking on the ladies for a bit, let's bring in a bunch of white non-Hispanic men and sit them down and have them take a math exam, right? And so, but we randomize things. The first group of guys, we say, hey, go through, take this exam. Other group of guys, we say, hey, go through, take this exam. P.S. Asian American students tend to score much higher on this than white men do, right? What we see in terms of some of this research, the evidence of stereotype threat, if I look at performance on the group who just completed the test and the group who didn't have that stereotype threat, the folks with stereotype threat performing worse on that exam than the folks who just were allowed to go through and take it, right? So we can see this in a number of different ways, Jonathan. It's sort of self-fulfilling prophecy for me, but then also some self-fulfilling prophecy for indirectly through others' actions on myself, on sort of me or sort of folks who are doing whatever, right? So a lot of different ways this can go through and pan out, which makes it hard to systematically control, sort of alleviate sort of things along those lines, because a lot of this stuff, as we'll see in the next piece, is going on probably outside of our awareness. Not always. Like sometimes people's stereotypes are fairly obvious. They'll tell them to you. But a lot of times this is going on outside of our awareness with stuff and sort of making subtle impacts on behavior. Other questions on stereotypes?
Can these self-fulfilling prophecies like fluctuate based on personality? Like kids that do better with like positive reinforcement, or say you were to say to me like women do worse in STEM, and if my personality is the type to be like, okay, women can be wrong, then that like can that be self-fulfilling prophecy like in the other sense, I guess? Yeah,
right. So there are a lot of individual differences, right? And so if you tell me, right, like, hey, Dr. Clapp, you're not good at math, right? But math is something that bald guys from central Wyoming aren't good at math, right? Well, I don't know, right? Like, I've had a lot of experience. I'm actually pretty good at this. So, all right, if that's what you think, I'm going to prove you wrong, right? And so we can go through and see that. But this type of self-fulfilling prophecy. This is a little bit different than stereotypes, but in clinical settings, sort of working with folks who struggle with depression, right? This sort of belief set that I'm no good. Anything I do, I'm going to fail at. Other people are going to think I'm terrible. There's no use because nothing's ever going to work for me, right? Well, that's a set of beliefs that I have, and what we see, and sort of one of the things that sort of consistently sort of maintain depression is, well, if I'm struggling with depression, I'm probably not working my best at my job, and so maybe I get passed over for opportunities, or maybe I don't put myself in the ring for opportunities, right? There's a promotion, but I feel like, I wouldn't be considered for it anyway, so I don't apply. And so if I don't apply, I'm not going to get it. And then I say, oh, look at everybody's sort of moving up the ladder, and I'm not, right? And it sort of it means that I'm no good, and that I'm not as good as other people, and things like that. Well, if we look, there's stuff that goes through and feeds this forward. So this is something that happens in stereotypes. So that happens a lot of different areas. But yeah, personality, individual difference sort of plays a lot into some of this stuff. But the thing I think that we should remember is that none of us are immune to this. And this is something that can start to impact my behavior and reinforce beliefs, even in ways where I might not necessarily mean to have it happen. All right. Other questions?
So are we just destined to be victims of bias in one form or another, or is there ways around this?
Vance, thank you so much for setting me up, because what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about prejudice, right? And if we're talking about prejudice, stereotypes, sort of my heuristic, it's sort of, oh, this is how this person is, or these are how groups are, things along these lines. If we're talking about prejudice, this is the endorsement of negative feelings, opinions, or beliefs associated with the stereotype, right? So we all are aware of stereotypes. We know what stereotypes are, right? If we're talking about prejudice, this is where I start to explicitly endorse and act on some of these things, okay? So not only am I aware of stereotypes about women in STEM, I actively endorse those. I think they're true. And so if I'm in a graduate program, I'm not going to accept women into my graduate program because I think that women aren't as good as men at this thing. This would be an example of prejudice. Okay. Advance two arguments for this whole issue on stereotypes and prejudice. One argument is that prejudice is universal and inevitable, right? The idea being that we automatically apply stereotypes in all situations, resulting in all of us having innate prejudice, right? This is something automatic and something that we can't sort of control. It's just widespread and it's just going to happen, right? Counter argument is that knowledge of a stereotype is not the same thing as accepting it or endorsing it, okay? The idea is that because we all grow up in sort of the same society, we're associated with the same sort of exposure to media and sort of community and things along these lines, that we're all equally knowledgeable about stereotypes. I don't have to be a prejudiced person. I know, like, if you ask me what stereotypes are for Black Americans or Mexican Americans or Asian Americans, right? If we're going sort of racial ethnic stereotype or sort of religious groups or things, I know what the stereotypes are. I don't endorse them, but I know what they are because I grew up in the same society as everybody else, right? And this counter argument will say that, yeah, knowledge of this stereotype has a much longer history of activation and can be activated automatically by sort of the presence of some group, right? So if I'm around somebody who's a member of a group of a stereotype that I am aware of, sort of the idea is that, yeah, that can in subtle ways start to influence my behavior, right? Because this stereotype is easily to activate, right? It's already there. And so stereotype consistent behaviors and sort of ideas are sort of start to be made present even in high and low prejudice groups. But the argument for, and this is the hopeful argument, is that given time and capacity and interactions, what we can do is start to inhabit that stereotype and start to replace that by some things that are more consistent with my actual beliefs. Okay, and so some interesting research is sort of beginning as sort of late 80s, 90s. They start to go through and look at this because it starts to get hard. Because if Madison, tell me all of your implicit stereotypes right now, right? You can't do that because they're implicit. Sort of they're down there. They're operating outside of your awareness, right? I would have liked to be like sort of measuring your physiological response right there. Back like, Madison, tell us all your prejudices about everything on film, right? But so the idea is that we can't go through, or people may not be honest about talking about their stereotypes, and so this is a difficult thing to measure, right? And so a series of researchers, or a series of studies by Patricia Devine, to go through and start to build evidence for this model. So in study one, what the researchers did is just went through and got individuals of high and low stereotypes. So they went through and screened people. And here, this research was on prejudice against Black Americans, right? And so what they did is they went through and got people who they knew to be high and low in prejudice, right? Because they had screened people, right? And asked individuals, both in high and low prejudice group, to list stereotypes about Black Americans. And what do you think they found across those two groups?
The stereotypes are similar.
Yeah, right? So it doesn't matter if I'm high in prejudice or low in prejudice, that both of these groups were aware of the stereotypes and could list them out, right? And so again, the instructions here are, hey, list all the stereotypes that you're aware of Black Americans, not saying that you endorse them, but just let us know what they said. They go through and write them out, and sort of both groups about the same knowledge of stereotypes, right? But then what they did, and this is where it gets cool, started to look at some automatic stereotype processing. Okay. So what they did is they had, again, brought people in high in prejudice, low in prejudice. So they know sort of where people stand in terms of prejudice sort of coming in. And what they did is they went through and had high and low prejudice participants as quick as they can try and identify the location of words. Okay. And so they went through 100 trials with this. And what this looks like is they said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to have you identify the location of some words. And what ends up happening in these types of paradigms is you got a screen, okay? And what I say is I say, okay, look at this screen. I want you to focus on this center dot right here, okay? And what they did is they went through and they provided some masks, right? And what they did is they just had people go through, and all you need to do if you're in this experiment, Maya, is you're looking at this dot, right? And I say on the keyboard, hit right or left, right? And all you need to do is say whether or not this thing happened to the right of the dot or to the left of the dot. And so what we do is we see something like that. But what it is it's a word that comes up below the threshold of perception. So you don't know what the word is. There's a mask over it. All you're doing is you're just hitting right and left, right? But in actuality, what was going on is the words that they were displaying to people, some of them were words that were consistent with sort of or relevant to black stereotypes, and some of them were not. Some of them were just sort of household items, okay? And so what they did is they had both individuals with high levels of prejudice and low levels of prejudice do this task, okay? And the conditions were in one group, about 80% of the words were consistent with stereotypes, okay? And the other 20% were neutral words. Other condition, 80% of the groups, 80% of the words that were displayed were non-stereotype words, 20% were. So we've got one group, so we've got people who are high and low in prejudice, right? But in one group, most of the words are stereotyped words, others are neutral words. In the other group, most of the words are neutral words, a small number of stereotypes, right? But the thing to remember is throughout this, the respondents or the participants didn't know sort of what those words were because they're too fast to read, and they were all masked, right? So after you say, okay, and go through, have you identify words, cool, thanks for identifying words. What they did is 80% had a prejudiced words, other had 20% prejudiced words. And so after we go through and we do this, then what they did is they said, okay, what I want you to do is I want you to tell me a little bit about the person in this scenario that I'm going to read to you. And so what they did is they read people a 12-sentence paragraph about some character named Donald. And what Donald is doing is Donald's engaged in some ambiguously hostile behavior. So Donald's demanding his money back on things. Donald's refusing to pay his rent until his apartment's repainted. And so after they go through and read this, what they do is they ask participants to rate Donald on 12 different traits. 6 are hostile related traits, 12 were not. Okay. And what they found was that regardless of whether or not people were high or low in prejudice, okay, so whether or not you came in if you were high and low in prejudice, what they found was that the folks who were in this condition where the majority of the words that they had saw were stereotyped words, that these individuals, regardless of their level of explicit prejudice, tended to rate Donald as more aggressive than individuals who had low prejudice words. Okay? Someone help me understand what's going on with this finding.
If you get 80% prejudice cues, and then you read about something, it's kind of like a stacked on experiment.
Yeah.
Like you see a bunch of prejudice words that you might take as a stereotype.
Yeah.
Then you apply it to the character you just read about.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly, Jonathan. And the idea is, right, and this is a super clever way to go through and study this, right? Because what they found, what the researchers are arguing here, is that regardless of what my existing, if I'm prejudiced against Black Americans or I'm very much not, right? What we did is we went through and primed those stereotypes, right? We went through and we, in the 80% prejudice condition, 80% of the 100 words that I saw were stereotype consistent words, and 20% of them were just neutral words, right? So even though I didn't know what words I read or what words flashed up, if you ask me, I say, I don't know, it was too fast to see them. But the idea is what that did is that primed these stereotypes, right? And then what do you do if you give me an ambiguous situation about Donald? We don't say whether Donald's black or white or anything other thing. Donald's just Donald. But what we found is individuals who got the higher proportion of prejudiced words, regardless of whether or not they were actually prejudiced against Black Americans, started to rate Donald as more hostile and aggressive than the folks who had gotten sort of less or fewer or sort of more neutral words, right? And so the idea and the argument is is that we can have things that are going on outside of our awareness that trigger these stereotypes. And even if I don't endorse these stereotypes, I'm aware of the stereotypes, and this can start to influence my perceptions and behaviors in ways that I might not be aware of. Okay? People see how they set this up and how this started to become pretty slick study. Okay. So the last study that they did in this series of studies that Devine put together was having individuals list their thoughts related to Black Americans. And again, we have people who have come in who are high in prejudice, people who are low in prejudice. And if you ask people who are high in prejudice against Black Americans and people who are low in prejudice against Black Americans, and you ask them to list their thoughts related to Black Americans, what happens? Do we see differences here? Yeah. People who are sort of prejudiced against Black Americans say prejudiced things, right? They'll tell you if we screen them in, like they'll write them down. The people who aren't didn't list sort of those types of things, right? And so again, taking this back to sort of this model of prejudice, right? We see that everybody knows the stereotypes, right? And everybody sort of is aware that they exist, right? And we see that exposure to things that can start to prime or make these stereotypes active in our brains can start to influence behavior in subtle ways, regardless of whether or not I actually endorse these. But if you ask me to say, hey, how do you feel? Sort of my conscious sort of beliefs and my sort of belief system overrides those stereotypes, right? And so if we're thinking about this, Vance, to go back to your question, like, is this just something that happens that there's nothing that we can do about it, right? People who do this type of work would say, well, that's pretty defeatist, right? To say like, well, stereotype just or prejudice just exists and there's nothing we can do about it because it's automatic. It occurs in varying degrees, right? There are some prejudice and some beliefs that people hold that are very explicit, and they'll tell you about them and have clear impacts on their behavior. Other times it's going to be more subtle, but I think what this research is demonstrating is that this is a thing. Like, it is something that goes through and impacts how we work and behave and interact. And sometimes this happens even if we're well-intentioned and we don't mean it to, right? So in terms of thinking about sort of moving forward, the recommendations in any of these type of things is to be open to the fact that, hey, sometimes I might, even if I don't endorse stereotypes, I might behave in ways that are subtly consistent with those stereotypes and be responsive to feedback in ways that can help correct and make us aware of them. Because if we're not aware of it, it's hard to change it, right? So again, Brooke, if I'm your STEM advisor or something like that, right? And I'm consistently funneling men into the more hard or more difficult or more prestigious sort of activities and women into less prestigious activities, if someone comes in and says, hey, I'm wondering sort of what's going on, because maybe I don't believe that women in STEM are sort of worse off or worse than men, but I might start to do things or pick up on other things. I'm like, oh, well, I put Brooklyn in this one as opposed to this one. But if we start to see systematic stuff, it's brought to my attention. Sort of like our knee-jerk reaction is to get defensive. Like, I wouldn't ever do that. Well, maybe not intentionally, but there are things that can start to happen that sort of influence my behavior in ways. And so if this is something that gets brought up, is difficult. But if we can go through and say, okay, boy, is this something that could be happening, and sort of then take stock. Sort of this is sort of the thing. But again, it's a hard thing to recognize and identify, particularly if it's sort of going on automatic and it's not consistent with my beliefs, because no one wants to think about like, oh, I'm a prejudiced person, right? Well, most people don't. Like, I can't speak for everybody, but for the most part, right, that you're like, oh yeah, no, I'm systematically excluding somebody, right? But it happens, right? And so just being aware of it can be sort of the first step in sort of going through and making some of those changes. So, Vance, that was probably a hugely unsatisfying answer to, can we change this type of stuff? But it's super hard, and it's insidious. It goes through and it impacts us, but this is kind of where we're at with stuff.
Hey, it worked. I got my end.
All right, cool. All right, so we'll stop there. We'll finish up with the last couple of slides on aggression on Friday. But questions about any of this material or anything we've covered?
Was this study done like within a time frame, or was he like study 1, study 2, study 3 all done separately?
Study 1, 2, and 3, I think were separate studies. So it's a good question, Jonathan. I don't think it wasn't. I don't think it was the same people that they went through and looked at each time. I think these were 3 separate studies, which starts to become just an example of good science, right? To see, sort of go through and looking and sort of building an argument for this model that they were advocating. Any other questions? All right, cool. You all are rock stars. Thanks for tuning in. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Let me know if you have any questions, or if people have questions, sort of concerns about where they're sitting in terms of grades and things along those lines. Otherwise, we'll catch you all on Friday. All right, cool. See you, everyone.